a second. So I just wanted to say that Katherine Solomonson is an associate professor at the School of Architecture at the University of Minnesota, where she teaches architectural history and served as the department's co-head, developing its Master of Science program and instituted its historic preservation program. Before coming to the University of Minnesota, she taught at Stanford University and co-directed the study of cultural landscape at East Palo Alto, California. Her book, well, she wrote the book on the Chicago Tribune tower competition entitled The Chicago Tribune Competition, Skyscraper Design and Cultural Change in the 1920s, examines the way in which this canonical competition and resulting building became engaged in the growth of culture and the product of national identity. So, well, thank you very much, Katherine, for agreeing to give this lecture. As I mentioned, you did, well, you wrote the book on the competition, something that has always been in the imagination of architectural history since its, well, since its inception, or since it originally emerged. And we couldn't think of a better person to invite to kind of give the lecture when we decided to include it in our series. It's also, well, maybe we can talk about this a little bit in the Q&A. It's also, like some of our other lectures, it's a friend that you are revisiting for us, you know, having basically published the book, put away your research, put it back on the shelf, and now, you know, almost 20 years later, you get an invitation to, 15 years later, you get an invitation to revisit that. So so I would be very curious to hear more about what it was like to basically maybe rethink this work through a kind of contemporary lens, and particularly maybe within this moment where things are disseminating, let's say globally, in another kind of way, much like the competition disseminated itself in a kind of proto-global way. So anyways, I leave the floor to you, Katherine. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you for having me. I wish that we were able to meet in person. We almost did. I left the day before my lecture was scheduled, and then, of course, it was canceled. So I certainly want to thank Solomon and Ludo for the invitation, and also for all they've done to organize this wonderful series. I was just saying before you all joined us, you all are probably the only people who have heard this particular group of scholars present, hear all of them present on these major competitions. And so it's just a pretty amazing series. Okay, as you all know, on June 10th, 1922, the Chicago Tribune announced an international competition for the design of what it called the world's most beautiful office building for the world's greatest newspaper. To achieve this, the newspaper promoted the competition internationally. It provided considerable latitude for experimentation, and it offered $1,000 in prizes as an inducement to architects to enter. 263 architects took up the challenge. They were from 23 nations, and they responded in widely and in some cases wildly different approaches to design. The competition's entries were generated at a time of ferment in architectural theory and design. Their relative merits provoked debate on both sides of the Atlantic after the competition, and they have continued to draw attention ever since, as we see here. A closer look at how the competition was organized and conducted and what happened afterwards helps to explain how and why the competition generated such a broad constellation of skyscraper designs. But in the 1920s, the competition was far more than the sum of its entries. For some, especially for the Chicago Tribune, the stakes were political as well as architectural. In the turbulent aftermath of World War I, the Tribune used the competition strategically to advance a strong nationalist agenda. How better to do this than through skyscraper design, through a quintessentially American building type, which Americans and some Europeans considered to be the United States' most contribution to modern design. So to explore this, we need to begin with the Chicago Tribune, which was the competition's sponsor. So I'm showing you here the Tribune's original building designed by Holabird and Roche. And the two men who were behind the organization of the competition. They're their chief executives and editors, Robert Rutherford McCormick and Joseph Medill Patterson. And the two of them were invested in transforming the newspaper to live up to its masthead, which they published every day, as you see in the upper left, claiming it to be the world's greatest newspaper. They used a variety of strategies to build circulation, and you see some of those strategies here in this montage of front pages. They used what they called both class appeal, trying to appeal to upper and upper middle class tastes, and mass appeal to appeal to everyone. And this included publishing a certain amount of sensationalism, entertainments like comics, as you see on the left, as well as some serious news and reporting. They were successful during their years running the Tribune up to the competition. Their circulation was growing. It started out mainly Chicago and the states immediately around Chicago. It expanded to include circulation all over the United States. And the Tribune consolidated its presence in the Northeast by starting the New York Daily News, known then as the Illustrated Daily News. And beyond that, they would eventually, within a few years, develop their own radio company and their own wire service to provide news nationally and internationally. In the process of building up the competition, major events transformed both the Tribune and their approach to thinking about what it could do. And this was the fact that the United States chose to enter the Great War in 1917, when it declared war on Germany. President Woodrow Wilson presented this as an important mission to make the world safe for democracy. And Robert McCormick and Joseph Patterson both got directly involved. They enlisted as officers, and they called for volunteers for the cavalry and the artillery, and both took their troops to France. Now, during the competition, not only were McCormick and Patterson, abroad with their troops, but the newspaper itself joined in the growing American propaganda machine that was carefully devised by George Creel, who was dedicated to spreading the gospel of Americanism to every corner of the globe, as well as throughout the United States. So they published propaganda like what you see in the center to get people to enlist. And they also styled the American mission as being like a crusade. And they used medieval imagery to suggest that American troops were coming to the rescue like crusaders. Remember this, because you're going to see this kind of imagery later, and it would have an effect on how the competition turned out. Now, during the competition, the Tribune's conception of both the United States's and its own place in the world started to change. I'm showing you here a map that the Tribune published during World War I. And this was so that readers could follow the progress of the war. But it was also a map that conveyed a message in itself. It's a rather unusual map. Do you notice anything different about this map than most maps you see today? Well, compare it to this one. You've got the Americas pushed over to the left. Returning back to this one, we have the United States, we have the Americas, dead center. And at this point, the Tribune was extending its wire service globally because it wanted to provide its version of news for the world. And it also began to publish its own edition, a European edition, based in Paris, as you see on the right. So by the war's end, the Tribune claimed itself to be the war's true victor. And you see victorious troops on the left. You see a cartoon published by the Tribune on the right, saying, the armistice day finds the world, including the Balkans and Mexico, pretty much at peace. But what does this image itself actually say? We have the American symbol, Uncle Sam, sitting there most prominently, actually well planted both on the United States and Mexico, and subordinating the whole rest of the globe to the American presence. So the war's aftermath was not all the triumph the Chicago Tribune wanted to claim when it published the headline at the bottom, "The Great War Ends." It was a time of considerable turmoil, of considerable violence in the United States, violence against African Americans, which I'm sorry to say we're experiencing all too much in Minneapolis. Riots were coming close to my house very recently. Widespread strikes, unemployment, all too familiar today as well. Deportations, the rounding up of people who are considered to be Reds to be Bolsheviks, seen as a threat to the future of the United States. And then, of course, the influenza epidemic, with millions and millions dead, far more than on the battlefield. In Europe, there was, of course, a great deal of turmoil as well. The Chicago Tribune was particularly concerned about, I could even say paranoid about, the November Revolution in Germany. And it joined the anti-Bolshevik rhetoric that you see in the poster on the right, because it was concerned about the specter of Bolshevism washing from the Soviet Union across Europe and then washing up on American shores and completely overcoming the United States. And the Tribune's gospel of Americanism, it felt, could help to combat that. And then, of course, there was the great deal of devastation in cities like Louvain, Ypres, and many other places, and the concern about strategies for reconstruction. So in the midst of all of this, the Tribune planned a competition for the design of this most beautiful office building in the world. Now, to understand how that played out locally, we first need to think about where this new building was to be constructed. So for decades, the Chicago Tribune, actually since its inception, it had been embedded in the dense fabric of Chicago's central business district, usually known as the Loop. And the red arrow on the left shows where it was located. But the Tribune was running out of room. There wasn't much room in the Loop. And so the Tribune acquired a new site, you see right up here, which is outside the Loop. These are the rail elevated tracks that define the Loop. Outside the Loop and across the Chicago River in an area that was commercially fairly untried except for light industrial. They constructed in 1919 the printing plant that you see over on the right. And this was were the surroundings of the new site when they first acquired it. They were right next to a soap factory, for example. And however, even though they were concerned about it, they also knew that this area was at a key point in the plan of Chicago, which Daniel Burnham and Edward Bennett had authored in 1909. This was a plan that presented this glorious vision of a transformed city, complete with a civic center at its very center, skyscrapers that are all leveled. They look like they've been buzzed down so that there's no competition for wonderful civic structures. Well, of course, that was an impossibility from the very beginning. A civic center was already being constructed elsewhere, and skyscrapers were in Chicago untamable. But this was the vision for this very area. The plan of Chicago envisioned north of the Chicago River a continuation of commercial development. And by 1919, I wanted to show you what the surroundings actually looked like south of the river, far from this ideal model that Burnham and Bennett were presenting, which truly they never thought could truly be realized, but an idea. In 1919, architects started to make proposals for the plaza right across the Chicago River, how to make this into a monumental public space. And so what most of them envisioned, including these two, were matching towers on either side. And to make it grand and as well coordinated as the plan of Chicago would suggest. We'll have to see a little bit later how that actually turned out. But in any event, the Tribune was buying into a grand vision. It wasn't buying into a decrepit industrial district. This is what the future would be, they hope. And it was getting better. The Wrigley building was constructed across the street, as you see here, a rival that helped to catalyze the planning of a competition for the design of a building that could surpass not just the Wrigley building, but any other office building in the world. Modest aspirations on the part of the Tribune always. So why hold an international competition? Why hold a competition at all? Well, one of the biggest reasons was that they wanted to advertise the Tribune. They wanted to promote circulation. They wanted to encourage advertisers to advertise in the Tribune because that's where they made most of their money. And good circulation led to more advertising. But then beyond that, there were also certain ideals that Robert McCormick and Joseph Patterson espoused and promoted, and that they wanted to promote through the competition. They wanted to promote the city of Chicago, not just as the second city to New York, but as a great city in its own right, one that might even surpass New York. They wanted to facilitate the development of civic unity in a fractured city. And they wanted to beautify the city by transforming the building that they would construct into a great monument to civic ideals. Beyond that, they wanted to advance American interests, both at home and abroad. And for this, in some ways, the Tribune competition served as a form of propaganda. So their first idea and how to arrange this competition was to make it a contest, to have it be like any of the many contests that they held to attract the attention of readers. Their idea was that anybody could enter, and then anybody could vote on their favorites. Whether they would actually choose that one as the winner was another matter, since McCormick and Patterson controlled everything. But they did make it possible for readers to send in their ideas, and you see some of their suggestions done by Tribune artists. But they very quickly realized that to be a serious competition, they could not hold it this way. The American Institute of Architects quickly intervened, and they insisted on a number of changes. Now, they were intervening not just in this competition, but they were also playing a role in debates about the competition system in the United States. Many architects felt that the competitions could be highly exploitive. It took a huge amount of time and a huge amount of money to be able to hold a competition, to be able to prepare the entries. And at the same time, many looked at this as an incredible opportunity to have a a chance at a commission they would never be considered for otherwise. So there were very strong mixed feelings about competitions. One of the things that the American Institute of Architects wanted to do overall was uphold professional standing and participation in competitions, and to hold them according to professional standards. So what impact did this ultimately have? Well, the Tribune competition, you know that there are many models for how competitions can be organized. And the Tribune competition turned out to be a mixed competition with professional oversight. A closed competition would have only invited firms, and they invited 10, all of them American architects, each of which received $20,000. Sorry, oh, they would love that, $2,000 for their work. Only professional architects were permitted to participate, but I have found no evidence of any form of screening about that. And besides that, the definition of what a professional architect actually was at this time was pretty volatile. So it would have been very difficult to do that kind of screening. They had a professional advisor who developed the program and oversaw the competition's conduct. And well, ideally, they would have a jury mostly composed of architects. You'll see in a few minutes how that actually turned out. One of the most attractive things about the competition to architects was the prizes. $50,000 in the first prize, which would go toward the commission, $20,000 second, $10,000 third. And just imagine how attractive that would have been at a time when so many architects were out of work everywhere, especially in the United States and Europe. And so the chance at a job and a chance to be paid well was a major thing. The competition program the professional advisor developed, his name is Cheney, was one that had both qualitative and very technical requirements. And I think most of you have had a chance to read the program. So I'm just going to distill it and go through it quickly. There were certain qualities they wanted: beauty and monumentality, distinctiveness, efficiency, and practicality. And I've listed them in this order purposefully. And then technical requirements, the narrow footprint for the building, the height, 400 feet, only 260 of which could be occupied. Why? You might have wondered about this. The reason is that the Chicago Building Code would only allow tall buildings to be occupied up to 260 feet. There could be towers and turrets and parapets and all sorts of other things, but no habitable space. And not surprisingly, not many people who commissioned skyscrapers wanted to pay for a whole lot of extra footage that couldn't be occupied. So that top then needed to be stepped back. And one of the amazing things about the competition is that there was an unlimited budget. The Tribune frequently said that it will be worth it to them to pay for the most beautiful building in the world. Here's the site information that was sent to architects. And as you can see, it doesn't give much of an intimation of the extraordinary aspirations for this particular site. It's very straightforward information that would allow them to understand to some extent the site where they'd be positioning the building. They also required a set of drawings, of course, and all of these drawings were to be the same size, the same format, and they're pretty standard. Elevations, front elevation, side elevation, section, plan of the first floor, the lobby, plan of an office floor. But the drawing that the Tribune made the most use of, they were most concerned about, was the perspective drawing. And this isn't surprising in itself, given that I think, as you all know, perspective drawings are the drawings that are used to reach a broader audience, to be persuasive. They present the building as it occupies space. And the angle that the Tribune specified for this perspective drawing presented it so that you would be seeing it as you come north on North Michigan Avenue. They wanted to understand what that view would actually be like. You'll be seeing the entry on the left a little bit later. So when the Tribune announced the competition to the public, they played up their the high ideals. This was to be a monument. It would create a model for generations of newspaper publishers. And of course, it would be a new and beautiful building for the newspaper company. But what is the most prominent aspect of this advertisement? Well, it is the inflated black numerals, $100,000, which was meant to attract both architects and the general public to something with such big prizes. The Tribune was also clever in presenting a skyscraper under construction at the top of the image. It invites people to imagine what that new building might eventually be. And it also plays on public fascination with skyscrapers and their the processes of their making. A very similar advertisement, but without the illustration, appeared internationally. And I'm showing you the French version. And if you read it through, you'll find it says about the same thing as the American version, except that architects should send drawings to the Tribune's Paris office. Now, I should say right now that the Tribune concentrated its efforts in recruiting participants in Europe and in the United States. They called it an international competition, but it was not a global competition. They made special diplomatic arrangements for German entries. This was connected partly with their concern about the specter of Bolshevism in Germany, partly as a much larger movement within the United States to try to stabilize the German economy as it struggled with paying reparations, as hyperinflation started to kick in. Throughout, so basically what it did for Germany then is that it used the diplomatic corps to make competition programs available to German architects and to enable them to easily ship their entries back to the United States. And of course, all of this served to add to American propaganda, which continued to try to spread the gospel of Americanism well beyond the boundaries of the United States and throughout Europe. And what better way to do that, as I said before, than to provide a competition for an American skyscraper and a fundamentally capitalist building type. So the outcome, showing you a map that gives you a sense of the places where the competition entries came from. So you're seeing, I'm focusing here on the Americas, and you're seeing 4 from Canada, 145 from the United States, 1 from Mexico, and 1 from Cuba. And then if you look over at the far right, Australia and New Zealand. But let's look in more detail at Europe. And you see the very good representation in Europe, but especially a concentration in 2 places, the Netherlands and Germany. So there were certainly similarities and considerable differences in the ways architects experience the competition. The way that they experienced the competition, the access to information they had, and the possibility that they could actually win. So I'm showing you here rare photographs of Tribune competitors. with their entries mentioned in Spitz in Chicago, Walter Gropius with the entry he designed with Meyer over on the right. They certainly had differences in available information, as I mentioned earlier, about the site. They also had considerable differences in knowledge of Tribune preferences. Chicago architects would have had a huge advantage because the Tribune throughout the competition published every week ideas for what their new building could be. And I'm showing you just two as representative examples. What would you get from this if you were watching the Tribune to find out what it wanted? The vast majority of the examples they showed were classical and Gothic. This would tell you something as you prepared your design, whether you would wish to go in that direction or not. But what most architects had in common was an interest in skyscrapers as a design problem. I'm showing you one Chicago skyscraper known for its innovation, the Reliance building in Chicago. And Chicago, of course, was known as one of the most innovative centers in skyscraper design then in the late 19th century and onward. And of course, also an interest in New York skyscrapers, and especially in the Woolworth building, which was the most famous skyscraper in the world until 1930. There was a veritable skyscraper fever in Europe. European architects, many of them, were well aware of what was happening in American skyscraper design. Many, like Vindigan and Loos, had traveled in the United States and seen American skyscrapers personally. Many others had seen them in photographs. And after the war, we see many examples of experiments with the skyscraper, not just as a means of rethinking the skyscraper as a building type, but also rethinking the city in relation to what the tall building could be. All right, hold on one sec. I think I'm about, let me see, ready to switch presentations, and I'll see if I can do this without having to leave screen sharing. There we go. Good. Okay. So this brings me then to the competition entries. How did people actually respond? Now, if you should have been able later to get a hold of the book that the Tribune published to document the competition, you could page through and you would see an array of designs like these. And after a while, your eyes might glaze over a bit. Maybe not for some of these. I picked out some of my favorites. But there's a certain commonalities among many of them. And basically, tall, slender towers. Many of them have a tripartite organization, clearly defined base, office floors, and top. Some of them don't, and that's significant too. And many of them have stepped back tops. And in some cases, it looks like those tops could simply be interchangeable. And this was the influence of the competition program, and it's worth revisiting it for just a minute to be reminded on how. All of them needed to be tall, slender towers because they had such a narrow footprint, a very small footprint, and one that was absolutely square. The maximum height of 400 feet, most entries took advantage of that. The fact that only 260 feet could be occupied and the top could be empty gave competitors latitude to do all kinds of curious things with that empty 140 feet. And then there were various experiments about how it could be stepped back, all with an unlimited budget. So let's see what some people did, as they also thought about the desired qualities of beauty and monumentality, distinctiveness, efficiency, and practicality. All right, design for advertising, or what an empty top can do for you. So a bit of a digression for a moment. The notion of using a tall building for an advertisement was far from new with the Tribune since the late 19th century, since the inception of the skyscraper as a building type. Corporations had seen the potential of their tall buildings to provide advertising. And tops got more and more clearly and creatively articulated to make the buildings and the corporations that built them visible on the skyline. And it also meant these buildings lent themselves to all sorts of collectibles like spoons or trays bearing their image. So architects who decided to address the challenge that Tribune presented to make a distinctive building, many of them grasped very quickly that advertising would be part of it. And we have three here of many that thought about the world's greatest newspaper, these global claims the Tribune was making. And they advertised the Tribune by surmounting the tower with various types of globes, simple ones, glowing ones, one that is so huge and that looks like it could be turning. And as you can see, this wasn't limited to just Americans. Many other distinctive attempts at the skyscraper, and I'm going to show you a few of the best known and also most puzzling entries. There aren't many entries I'm going to talk about at any length, so I hope you'll pardon my speed as I go through them, but Los is definitely worth a pause. This was an initial sketch he made on a letter that appears to have been sent to a diplomat. So it's possible he had diplomatic assistance in getting the competition program too. So it's very similar to the design that he eventually submitted. Now, often in the late 20th century, early 21st century, it's been assumed that this building was on Los's part meant to be a joke. And, that's not necessarily, a surprising claim, considering how satirical Los could be in his writing. But there are a couple of pieces of evidence that suggest that he may have taken this very seriously. So one piece of evidence is the statement that he sent along with his entry to the Tribune. All architects needed to write a statement about their design, and along with most of the drawings, most of those statements have been lost, unfortunately. I'm hoping that more people will be working on the Tribune competition at some point. Mine is far from the last word. I don't believe in definitive works. And it's possible people will find more drawings than I ever could. But in any event, Los. So Los's statement said that he saw this as this beautiful, gleaming, polished black Doric column to be appropriate for a newspaper company in particular. And he referred to the time that he had spent in Chicago back in the 1890s, and also working in journalism, to say he knew what this meant. And he said he knew a newspaper would want something that would be an explosive presence that would attract a great deal of attention. And he was certain that his column could do that. It's also been suggested that he's using the column also as a commentary on the way that many architects used a columnar metaphor to describe the skyscraper: its base, its shaft, its capital. And we do indeed have our tripartite organization here, the base being habitable office floors. And he submitted a plan that showed the entire building to be habitable up to its top. Now, based on this, you could still say, this might have been tongue-in-cheek. He might have been just joking as he prepared this entry. But there's one other thing, which is an account in a memoir written by his wife, Elsie Altman-Los. And she recalled that he spent months working on this project. He brought assistants in to help him with it. He gave it a lot of thought, and that he cared about it quite a lot. and that he was enormously frustrated when he discovered that it didn't arrive in time to actually be judged. So what he did is he decided that he needed to try to convince the Chicago Tribune to reconsider. And he found out that one of the editors, Robert McCormick, was going to be on a train across the south of France. Los was living in Nice, and he got on that train. He made his way to Colonel McCormick's compartment and had an audience with him. He walked in, and there were all these American men laughing loudly. He felt he was treated rather rudely because though they listened to him, they were not interested in what he had to say. He was expelled from the compartment, went home and talked to his wife, who comforted him by saying, yes, they must have been drunk. They're just being Americans. So Los never got what might have been a sincere dream to see his giant column erected on the North Michigan Avenue Bridge Plaza. But we can thank Thomas Kemmerer for showing us what it might have looked like if it had actually been constructed. Very well. Another of the puzzling entries was submitted by Bruno Taut, who is well known for the designs that he made for Stadtgrün and city crowns, these glowing crystalline structures that would surmount communities, provide a centerpiece for them, a way of unifying them. And I'm showing you examples for the elaboration of these ideas in Alpine architecture here. So what Los has done is he's given us this lovely, simple, crystalline structure, basically structure of just all steel and glass, a modified Gothic form, this tapering, very graceful structure. And he said in his statement, which also survives, that he felt that to be appropriate for a newspaper company, he wasn't thinking about advertising here the way Los was. He was thinking about value. And he felt that newspapers were worth their weight in gold for facilitating the free circulation of public opinion. And that therefore this building should be gilded so that it would glow like this. Another puzzling entry that may or may not have been a joke was submitted by two German architects. And what they've done is obvious. They've created a very basic office building, and they've placed on top of it an American Indian wearing a Plains Indian headdress, holding a tomahawk aloft. Now, why would two German architects be interested in American Indians? Well, generations of German children had read the novels of Karl May, which was set in an imagined American Wild West with the tales of Indians and cowboys and explorers and so on. And so they were very well aware of at least a fictive notion of who American Indians were. But if you dig a little deeper, you also find in the German press lots of discussion about the tragedy of the ways that Euro-Americans were treating American Indians. So they both use one a perspective purely from the perspective of entertainment in May's novels to a very acerbic critique of American policies were present in Germany. It is hard to know, it's impossible to know what Mosdorf and Hahn were actually thinking. At first glance, this might seem to be a fundamentally racist image. We can't know, but what we can know is that he was also playing with the iconic form of the Statue of Liberty, replacing the torch with the tomahawk, and composing the building so that its massing was very, very similar to the massing of the Woolworth building, as you see on the left. So I'll leave it to you to draw your own conclusions about exactly what is going on here. But it's quite a remarkable fusion of American iconic elements. Now, the Woolworth Building. Why was the Woolworth Building of such interest? This is not the only example of a design that was based on the Woolworth Building that I'm going to be showing you. So let's take just a moment to see that. So basically, the Woolworth Building was the tallest building in the world until 1930. It's 60 stories tall, 792 feet high. And it was a building that was well known all over the United States and all over Europe. Cass Gilbert made sure that European architects had the opportunity to see his building. Shortly after it was finished, he sent photographs and drawings and a model to Paris to be exhibited at the École des Beaux-Arts. They were exhibited in England, in Germany, and so on. And then photographs of it circulated all over the place. And I wish I could find an example, but one photograph I've seen of the Woolworth Building, I think in Germany, was one where they decapitated the Woolworth Building so that, you know, its historicizing crown was gone. And this incredibly rational machine building that expresses its steel frame was all that was left, because that's what fascinated many, many European architects. So here are a few other Woolworth Building imitators. And you know, these buildings, you know no limit in style. I'm showing you over on the right, Bijvoet and Dijkers design from the Netherlands, which is a complete reconception of that building, transforming it into terms that American architects would never have envisioned at the time. And it's possible that they were drawing, you know, not just on their knowledge of American skyscrapers, but also on the work of Frank Lloyd Wright, whose work was, of course, published in the Netherlands and in Germany. As we can see, these hovering horizontal planes that you could see as somewhat Wrightian. So these transformations of the skyscraper and of the Woolworth Building, and this reconception of what the skyscraper could be is really quite extraordinary. And one thing that we can see in especially Bijvoet and Dijkers designs and some of the others that I'm going to show you was the stimulus provided by visions of the American skyscraper. And here I'm going to refer to my colleague Gail Fenske, who's written the best thing you could ever possibly read on the Woolworth Building. And basically, she said that by the early 1920s, New York and the Woolworth Building, it basically had inspired decisive perceptual shift among the architects of Europe, the European avant-garde. All proposed future-oriented designs for European skyscrapers or cities of skyscrapers. Such visionary schemes and infrastructural depth to reconfigure the city would eventually make their American counterparts aware of the technologically audacious and indeed wholly modern world that they had in fact invented. And that's a quote from Gail Fenske. So let us see how that actually worked, because we can see in a few minutes the competition as offering a beginning for that. But first, we need to consider the historicizing styles that dominated the vast majority of the entries, influenced partly by spreads like these. Gothic, many Gothic style designs, inspired by the Wrigley Building, Woolworth Building, inspired by the notion that the Gothic style, being a skeletal form of construction, was appropriate for expressing the steel skeleton of the tall building. Modernized Gothic designs like these. And then a whole array of other sorts of historical references, from a huge triumphal arch to a building that looks like Hagia Sophia has been transplanted to its top. But let's consider Chicago again. And think about this being a Chicago competition and the question of where the Chicago school, or what was more commonly called Chicago's commercial style, was in all of this. So many people who entered the competition were well aware of some of the innovations in the design of skyscrapers that Chicago had triggered in the late 19th century. Well, I wanted to show you an example of architects associated with that group. And on the right are buildings that they designed not much earlier. On the left, a semi-medieval tower of transformation. What happened to the Chicago school? To some extent, it was beginning to fade by this time. And by Chicago School, this umbrella opens out to include the work of Louis Sullivan, let me see, like here, and Frank Lloyd Wright, and many others. To some extent, this was beginning to fade, but to some extent, as with Schmidt, Garden, and Martin, it wasn't so much departure from their ideas about design as expediency. They must have been reading the Tribune and would have had a sense of what could get them the work that they needed. But then we go here. We look at Gropius and Meyer's design and this marvelous transformation of Chicago school ideas. Basically, this is a design that they produced while they were still in Weimar, but this was just at the moment where their interests in design were shifting towards a more sachlich approach to design, more rational, the neue Sachlichkeit. And they certainly expressed this in this building, which so fully expresses the steel frame that supports it, or at least we can surmise it was a steel frame, could have been reinforced concrete. And that also takes an element that was very familiar in Chicago, the Chicago window. And I just wanted to show you an example, not to suggest that this is what they were looking at, but the Chicago windows in Carson Pirie Scott with their broad panes and sash windows on either side. And they have filled the entire building with this. And rather than creating a fanciful top, they've given us fully useful office floors that rise up to the top. This is a functional design all the way through. Other architects looked at other dimensions of Chicago buildings. So Van den Hende of Belgium produced this design. And this might remind you a bit of the Reliance building, unless you really look at it, and that's what he presented. This is the way he topped it. So it's a really, really curious hybrid with globe, trumpeting elements, everything you can think of to make this building a good advertisement on top of a nice Chicago skyscraper down below. And then Max Ronenberger, who not only transformed anything that you might have seen in late 19th Chicago, but transformed it in such a way that it also challenged ideas about what the city could be. Rather than making the building rise up straight from the lot line, this is a building that is cruciform in shape, which prohibits the standing shoulder to shoulder the way American skyscrapers generally do, and demanded space around it. This is like looking at a fragment of a city of towers with open space between them. And this is the type of condition that some German architects felt were quite chaotic, that they wished to challenge. And then Hildersheimer and Byfoot and Diker, again, a transformation which takes, as Gail Fensky said, a building type that Americans had invented and transforms it and reveals it in a new way. So, okay, this is time for me to give you an intermission, 5 minutes, and then the end will go quickly. All right, so would you like to stretch for a few minutes? And I will actually set my timer and I'll see you back here. I'll be noisy when I come back. Okay, hi everybody, I'm back. And if somebody could say the word, I'll get going again. Well.
Great, we're ready?
All right,
Yes.
So judging the designs, who decided how and how? All right, so as the designs were coming in, the professional advisors set them up for exhibition and the jury got together. I wanted to introduce the members of the jury. As you recall, the AIA preferred that it be dominated by architects. Over on the right, you can see the one architect who was on the jury as its chairman, McCormick and Patterson, and two of their subordinates in the Tribune Company, who were not in much of a position to argue with them. So you can see the way the two editors maintained quite a lot of control over the competition's outcome. Now, the deadline for United States entries was to be November 1st, but the Tribune provided a grace period for international entries to allow for the time it would take for them to be shipped. Well, this grace period didn't necessarily do international entries much good, because if you look at this calendar, on the 13th, the jury cast its first ballot. There were only 167 of 263 designs there. Only 20 of them were international. And when they did this ballot, they chose what would be the first prize, and it never changed. So foregone conclusion here. And then finally, by the 30th, when which was the international deadline or the end of the grace period, there were 189 entries and they made their selections. So with 189, you can know that there were so many entries that we're very familiar with today, many of which I talked about, like Gropius, Los, Taut, Byfoot and Diker, and so on, that never made it in time even to be considered. So after their final ballot, it was contentious. It was a contentious ballot. The chairman of the jury, the single architect, argued for a different design to be third prize, but he was overruled. And for third prize went to Holabird and Roche. And you may recall that Holabird and Roche had designed the building the Tribune was occupying at the time of the competition. So in a way, this went to insiders. Now, how could this happen? In theory, the competition entries were all supposed to be submitted anonymously. All the judging was to be of anonymous entries. Still, third prize for Holabird and Roche. Second prize, Eliel Saarinen. Saarinen teamed up with two Chicago architects, Bertel and Grenman, and for the design of his entry. But he was the lead designer. Now, he's an architect. His entry came in at the very last minute. And the jury later wrote about how they were just blown away by its beauty, and they had to include it in their consideration. As it happens, Robert McCormick was quite familiar with Saarinen's work, especially because he was a great admirer of the Helsinki railroad station. So it wouldn't be surprising if he encouraged Saarinen to participate in the competition, maybe even helped provide Chicago connections. We'll talk about that a little bit more later. And then finally, first prize went to John Mead Howells and Raymond Hood of New York. Now, at first glance, it might appear that they had no special connections at all, but digging a little bit deeper, one of the things that I found was that John Mead Howells' wife, Abby, was, well, on the Tribune's board of directors. So there was a direct inside connection. And so how these anonymous entries wound up with this trio of first prizes, we can only guess. But there was one of the things that the AIA was most concerned about was insider knowledge and wire pulling, and all of that might have been the case for this. So, in the end, as I'll argue in a minute, this building served the Tribune's purposes very well. But at the same time, it's hard to get around the fact that there was a very direct personal connection with the Tribune here. So the report of the jury said that one of the gratifying results of the competition has been to prove the superiority of American design. And they loved the fact that, the one foreign design that they thought was of surpassing beauty came not from established cultural centers. These are their words that I haven't all included here, like Paris, but rather from a small northern country like Finland. So that finished design is a design that they really loved. But let's consider why the Tribune chose a Gothic design instead. And one of the reasons, I'm quite sure, is how distinctive that crown was. So they wanted a building that would stand out on the skyline and have a very distinctive silhouette. And certainly a building crowned with flying buttresses like this and with lots of ornamentation would achieve that. They wanted a building that would be a soaring building that would have its verticality emphasized. Well, the Saarinen design did that, but for the Tribune, they also connected this specifically with the Gothic style, and they used all kinds of spiritual metaphors in describing the building. This soars with spiritual aspiration and so on, and their goal being to try to elevate the significance of their building beyond the realm of the commercial to make it a cultural monument of greater significance. Plus, as you'll see over there on the right, that fancy Gothic top took to floodlighting just beautifully. And that top was also great as a tourist attraction. It enabled people to take the fastest elevators in town to the top and peer at the surroundings from the perspective of the Tribune. And it continued to be a tourist attraction until they closed the top in the mid-20th century. But at the same time, this building that had these other associations was also modern, practical, and efficient. It served the Tribune's purposes very well. It had the number of office floors they needed. They eventually filled the crown with offices, and they were able to combine the tower with their printing plant that was right behind it to create a highly efficient workplace for the Tribune. And then beyond that, it was a modern machine building in every respect, and this was all enabled by the rational steel frame, which the Gothic style, until it gets to the top, expresses. There were other reasons why they gravitated toward the Gothic style. One was that they thought about the building as if it were a type of cathedral. The Woolworth building had been dubbed the Cathedral of Commerce. This was cathedral-like too. In some ways, it was a city crown. They thought of it as a city crown, much the way Bruno Taut conceived his. And they drew upon long-standing ideas about medieval cathedrals as being standing at the center and unifying their communities, just as the Tribune said it hoped to do through the design of a building that wanted to make Chicago's own. But beyond that, we need to look to World War I and the Western Front. The design was based on a number of French and Belgian church towers that were part of the Western Front or just outside it. But the closest analog is the Butter Tower of Rouen Cathedral, one of the cathedrals that actually wasn't damaged during the war. Now, this connection with France was personally important to McCormick and Patterson, who were among the crusaders who went to France in an effort to liberate it and make the world safe for democracy, as Wilson said. This was an experience that they wanted to commemorate through the building. And they did that through the design, the overall design of the building, and through its details, through the fleur-de-lis that are embedded in its ornamentation, through the rather good caricature of Robert McCormick in uniform, right in the very center of this. And other allusions to World War I abound throughout the building. And so in many ways, this was both a war memorial, a celebration of American triumph, and a celebration of their own masculine heroism, which they wrote quite a bit about. And then beyond that, the base of the Tribune Tower has embedded within it stones that foreign correspondents have gathered from all over the world. The Tribune regarded the United States as inheriting the best of European tradition in the wake of the tragedies of World War I, thinking of the course of empires flowing ever westward, and now claiming Chicago as the capital of the new inland empire of the United States. And what better could it be than an adapted Gothic design, using the best of American technology to transform it into a building they felt could surpass anything in Europe, standing on a base supported by fragments of European monuments. Well, critical responses were mixed. Some felt that it was a gift to Chicago that expressed the ideals of journalism and democracy. Some weren't so pleased. Edward Bennett, author of the Chicago Plan, felt that it destroyed the Michigan Avenue Bridge Plaza by creating a skewed pair of unmatched buildings. His letter, you could almost see tear stains on it. He was so upset. Louis Sullivan, who was the godfather of Chicago, the Chicago School, felt that the use of the Gothic design was terrible in every way. If the United States, he said, had fought for democracy during the war, what was it doing embracing a symbol of feudalism and autocracy? This is undemocratic, it's un-American, and to make it even worse, it's fake, because it is a fairly amiable building when you get up to its shoulders, but then on top, it has flying buttresses, which are structural elements in a Gothic cathedral, but they require steel frames to support them. And the result is a building that looks like it has a spider crouched on top, extending its legs down to earth. He thought it was creepy. But what he loved was Louis Sullivan's, Eliel Saarinen's design. He felt that it truly expressed the American spirit of democracy, that it summed up everything ultimately that he felt was important in design. So I say here it expresses the Sullivan spirit as much as the American spirit. Its accentuation of verticality, the way that it creates this, as it steps back, this telescoping, highly integrated structure that shoots up unimpeded to the sky, no cornice impeding its ascent. He felt that it was a travesty that the Tribune threw away what he called a pearl of great price. Well, the Saarinen design was a design the Tribune also loved, but they never could. The jury report praises it, giving it more space than just about any other design. And but the Tribune was, so ardently nationalistic, so bent on proving the superiority of American design and the position of the United States as a world leader, that they never could have chosen an entry by an architect who wasn't American. But they had their dreams. So at one point, the Tribune editors thought maybe they would build a version of Saarinen's design across the street. That didn't come about, but they did even better. They paid to bring Eliel Saarinen to the United States and set up a practice in Chicago. Ultimately, they, through Saarinen, had a much greater impact on design than they ever could have imagined. He went on to be the director of a highly influential design school, Cranbrook, which had an immense impact on American design through its students, including Eliel Saarinen's own son, Eero. And beyond that, I'll show you the impact that Saarinen's design had in other ways in just a moment. So in the competition's aftermath, Saarinen's design joined many others in this burlap-bound book, which was widely circulated. And images from it were published in Europe and the United States in newspapers and journals like Bennigan and others. And you have seen, all of you, how they are embedded in Bennigan. And one of the points I'd like to make about this, as well as other European publications, is that the competition was often framed in Europe in the context of the American city and possibilities for the future of cities and the role of the skyscraper in this process. So not surprisingly, Bennigan would choose Gropius and Meyer and Saarinen's designs to be featured. And then Wasmuth, too, published an article on the Chicago Tribune Tower competition. But before it even gets there, there's a long section up front that is all about the American city in various dimensions until they finally get to the two top prize winners, and then the whole selection of competition entries that could only have come from the competition book or a press kit that the Tribune circulated. And finally, by the late 1920s, in the United States, Saarinen's design was presented as the culmination of one era and the beginning of a new era. As the frontispiece of the story of American architecture. And one of the most important impacts it had in the United States was its effect on the city. And Saarinen very much thought about his building in urbanistic terms. So basically, his design came in not long after New York passed a zoning law that required stepped back tops. Other cities, including Chicago, would soon embrace this in order to prevent having deeply dark canyons of streets. But how to do it? And there were many speculative ideas. And Saarinen's design inspired many of them, as you see here. And then eventually inspired quite a few imitators, including one that was by one of the architects who designed the winning entry. And you can see imitators as far away as Shanghai. So last bit here, changing histories. Howells and Hood and Saarinen's design in the dominated the conversation, at least in the United States, during the 1920s. But by the mid-20th century, for reasons I'm sure all of you can surmise, it was Gropius and Meyer, Hilbersheimer, and others who received the greatest attention and acclaim, those who addressed the Tribune competition. You can trace the history of 20th century architecture through reactions to the Tribune competition. And then finally, in 1980, the advent of postmodernism We have Stanley Tigerman and Stuart Kahn revisiting the Chicago Tribune Tower competition and seeing it as a way of reevaluating the full range of entries, rethinking what could design to be, and relegating modernism safely to the past. So they published all of the entries again in a book that also included a group of architects' designs for late entries, which you see right here. And in their discussion, Gropius and Meyer, Hilbersheimer, and certainly Mies van der Rohe were pushed into a past that they were now surpassing. And instead, once again, they were praising Adolf Loos's design, especially with the beginning of the resurgence of classicism in the late 20th century. Saarinen's design, and Saarinen once again had many, many imitators. So just a few years ago, it was revisited again at the Chicago Biennale when architects were invited to do their new conceptions or rehashings of Tribune competition entries. They lended themselves very well to playful reinterpretations. But then finally, there's the Tribune Tower, which is still there. It is being now converted into residences. The Tribune is no longer associated with it, but it continues to attract a fair amount of tourist attention, certainly my attention. And it provided the Chicago Tribune an amount of advertising that, through the century would have surpassed its wildest imaginings. All right, thank you. And I hope we have a little bit of time for questions.
Thank you, Catherine. It's very nice. Which I very familiar with. And it's very nice to talk about all the parameters. Yeah, in this usual circumstance, what we do is we put the questions forward to our students who have things prepared.
Hello, thank you for your lecture. It was very interesting. Sorry about the bells. I wanted to ask actually about the condos that you mentioned, because I also was researching a little bit about it, in the internet. And I wanted to know your opinion in the change of into actually like these luxury condos, and what does this mean for the city itself, and also the newspaper's identity, so the whole history of it. Okay,
really good question. I mean, it's a very interesting process. I mean, in so many American cities, tall office buildings are being converted into condominiums and hotels all over the place. And, so some of it is part of, an applauded return to the city. At the same time, if you're interested in this issue, read Robert Brugman's book on suburbia, because one of the things he argues is that, at the same time as you see, the conversion of, so many older buildings, and I think he's particularly concerned with formerly industrial buildings, he argues that this is a process, that counterintuitively is also part of a process of de-densification and emptying out. So, what happens when there's an office building that attracts many, many people, huge number of people, far more people than would have expensive condos in that building, who pour into the city for work and provide, patronize surrounding businesses. And, in many ways are keeping the city alive. What happens when that building has a reduced population as it's transformed into condominiums? And you can, say the same about warehouses and mills and commercial other forms of commercial buildings. So it's an enormous change in our cities. And then beyond that, for the Tribune, I think that the Tribune's identity is still very closely associated with that building. I don't think they're letting go of that. I have not seen yet any move to rename it. I mean, with the Sears Tower, it's been renamed. Many tall buildings are renamed with for their dominant tenants. But this one doesn't. And, one thing with skyscrapers is that, they were always not just associated with the corporations that paid for them, but also, their tenants, the people who rented office space, not working for the company, the building's identity would accrue to them, would become associated with them, and provide status. So you could say, yes, my office is in Tribune Tower. So it's very possible it'll work in a similar way. And the Woolworth building, condos too. What do you think about it?
Actually, yeah, I went into their website and saw a little bit of inside. Yeah, it's definitely like advertising this luxury idea of it, and like for example, this idea of the lady standing out and looking the view with a cup of coffee. So it's a little bit also being it's giving it a type of like domesticity, which it didn't have before. So it's definitely interesting to look into. Like, I think they made also like a pool or a gym center down in the ground floor. So yeah, I think I'm not sure. I haven't thought about it, but it's definitely interesting to see it keeping the same identity that it has, but also changing the inside as well.
Yes, and what you're saying about the women with coffee. I mean that also connotes leisure, and and you're talking about all the amenities in the building. So it's a piece of a landscape of domesticity and leisure. And then what happens to our city is we find more and more buildings converted into amenities. So if this is your project, you have a really interesting one. I'd be interested in seeing what you do with this. So, okay. Did that answer your question?
Steph? After hearing your lecture, it seems quite obvious that international architects never really stood a chance. I was wondering, to what extent did they believe they did? And especially in terms of the modernist entries, the modernist submissions, was it perhaps more of a vehicle to promote something else than actually winning the competition?
I think you may have a good point there. I think that's very possible. I think that, so let's think about Gropius and Meyer. I think the German architects should have believed that they'd have a chance, at least for their designs to be considered. And so few of them were. I mean, basically the diplomatic service was supposed to ensure that they would get there in time. And my colleague Dietrich Neumann, who's written extensively on German skyscrapers, has suggested that the post-war anti-German sentiment in the United States may have something to do with blocking the receipt of those designs. Because, I mean, the way this was set up, basically, many of them didn't really have a chance. But I think also your point about the speculative nature of a number of the designs, and the desire to be able to make a point, explore an idea, and make a point through the drawing. And even though, say, Gropius and Meyer's design didn't get there in time, it wound up making a point. It was a point that was best made 20, 30 years later, but it wound up making a point, having an impact.
Sorry, I'm going to interject. Do you hear me? Because I'm having a bit of problems with my internet, but I want to just interject in this because as we all know, a few years ago, there was the Grenfell Tower horrible fire in London. And now recently, there has been London, a place where basically the skyscrapers only existed for the last decade and a half. There was all sorts of proposals on the table for, let's say, timber construction, high-rise timber construction, for the kind of, new way of building, and that has now been sort of scrapped. And I just try to relate the issue of the tower of Chicago in Chicago as a the steel frame, etc., and trying to relate this to a kind of contemporary context is, what do you think that kind of form of structural innovation that allowed the tower to go higher? In that sense, what the kind of symbolism of forms, it wasn't about higher or bigger is better. It was basically more about a kind of sort of symbolic essence, as William Jordy would have written about it 70 years ago. What if we were to talk about some of the more pertinent ideas for today from the competition? What do you think would be potentially relevant for contemporary practice? And I know that you're coming from a kind of design culture as a historian and theorist, but basically, what would be what can we learn from this competition, or at least maybe the reception of this competition today, in terms of let's say symbolic forms of representation, structural innovation, etc. Institutional, corporate or institutional identity. The idea that a corporation can have a project. Would Facebook ever do such a kind of project today? No, but Apple tried to do it with by hiring Fosters, just to throw it out there in a kind of incongruent way, but just to kind of make some kind of relation to the contemporary. Guys, I know it's your platform, but I felt to interject.
Oh, no, thank you. You've given me actually many platforms to consider here. So structurally, since that's where you started, so the steel frame, I mean, one of the reasons it could push buildings higher was not just its capability, structural capability, but also fireproofing. And that was absolutely crucial. It could not be considered, a tall building could not be considered without without fireproofing as part of the argument for its existence. So, when you talk about fires in skyscrapers, I got caught in a fire alarm situation in a high-rise in Chicago, and there's nothing like walking down 44 floors. In any event, though, I mean, when you introduce timber framing into this, it's just such a compelling possibility that is, so difficult to want to let go of, given that this is a sustainable form of construction. But the question is how do you, and I don't know the answer to this. I definitely could ask some of my colleagues, but I don't know how timber framing would be fireproofed. So in thinking about the possibilities, the technological possibilities the steel frame presents, the building, it could have been much, much taller than it actually was. And it was, Chicago's height limits that had an impact on that. But as you were saying, the symbolic significance of the building and of the entries was really what prevailed overall, at least from the Tribune's perspective. And if we're thinking about this for today, I mean, just the most basic answer I can give is that any building has significance. Even the blandest, seemingly blandest building is saying something and is meaningful. One of the challenges here, of course, is that, you know, I've talked about what the Tribune Tower meant to the editors in the 1920s, but meaning, of course, is unstable. It constantly changes. The buildings are remade continuously, not just in terms of their adaptations to new purposes, but also their meanings. And that's, of course, true then, true now. I think that you might be getting at something more specific, though. Or are you?
The well, on the one hand, it's like basically technological innovation, symbolic form, and let's say civic representation all are sort of inextricably intertwined. And that basically very much happens in Chicago more than any other global city or any other international city at that point. And that's more than New York. I mean, right now you're in the Lever House, which basically many decades later decides to take on to gain a corporate identity. But basically these things already happen beforehand in Chicago. So in that sense, it's not a second city, even though it tries to measure. So architecturally, it's a place of architectural intervention. Even today, I still think that Chicago is probably the most progressive architectural city than LA or New York, to go to the polls as the kind of centrality. So I just wonder, where are these, so that kind of idea of a kind of progressive idea, and I don't mean that necessarily politically, the political implications in that, but that forward thinking, or if architecture is basically a projective and speculative action, the idea that a kind of corporation, a media corporation, can basically engage in these kinds of things simultaneously and project forward a kind of image, I think it's very, it's very fascinating and interesting in this way. Is how do you basically align all the kind of economic, social, political determinants that form a kind of building? Rather, as you said, even if it's a bland building, you know, these things are always embedded into a building project, right? Whether it's the most banal suburban American house or canal house, a faux canal house, there's some buildings are representative of something, right? So
Yes.
yeah, that's what I was just trying to get at, to basically maybe
Sure.
synthesize a little bit that.
So I think that put it really well. And, you know, your comment about the significance of a newspaper company, the Tribune competition never could have been what it was without being sponsored by a major company that was building a media empire.
Yeah.
That had a global reach and that could also package everything so fully. I mean, I think they must have been thinking about this from the beginning in the way they specifications for the drawings, and that carries right through to the way they're published, the way they were put on exhibition, and so on. It's like, how are we going to make this visible to a larger public? And then in the process of doing all of this, and through this, I left this out for reasons of length, but an important part of this was it was conducted in the press simultaneously as the architects were working on their designs. And there was a barrage of newspaper articles about the competition and frequent invitations for Chicagoans to give their feedback. And one of the things that the Tribune was trying to do is at least provide the image of a participatory process, which in the book I wrote on this, I thought of in Benedict Anderson's terms as an effort to produce an imagined community, and very much so, and basically at least an image that there's a unified community, that there's all this participation, that this Gothic cathedral-like tower is going to stand for this community. And it's, you know, ironic given the amount of innovation that's occurred in the past in Chicago and has continued, and I would agree with you on that, that they would, you know, hold so dear a Gothic tower. And I think, you know, I found reasons for that. But, you know, they were trying to claim that, you know, a particular notion of high culture that prevailed in Europe and the Northeast was also Chicago's. And that this could be reconciled with all of the conditions of modernity. So, and as far as why those conditions existed in Chicago, I mean, even then it was considered a Western city. I mean, the word Midwest was coming into use, but it was a city that was out there. It was the gateway. It was the gateway to the West, and it you know, was considered, you know, it wasn't beyond the bounds of you know, Eastern ideas by any means. There was so much investment from the East in Chicago, but the conditions were very different. But the Woolworth building was preceded the Tribune Tower and was very much its equal in presenting the building as a civic monument, a cathedral of commerce. But as far as it was primarily a cathedral of Woolworth. And as far as, you know, really taking it to the limits, as the Tribune did, to make it a civic monument, it didn't come close. Yeah. All due respect to Gail Fensky.
No, of course. But so to our audience, some other questions, I'm sure.
Yeah, I have a comment question. Also to reflect on Solomon's comment. So I find this the idea of symbolic relevance. It's quite relevant for this particular competition, but also the way they chose to represent it, as you said in your presentation, by using the perspective as the main sort of drawing, which would target also the larger audience. But also in your text, you say that they were very strictly, they were very strategic in the way they wanted to place this perspective. And they also, if I'm not mistaken, they were allowed only to put one figure as a scale in these drawings.
Yeah.
Which is quite interesting to me, because if we make a reflection to today's way the competition are represented, we have all these immense figures and happy kids and balloons and all these things which hide the architectural elements, whereas in this competition the architectural elements really came forth, but also the way this perspective was chosen. I don't know why it gives a sort of a Gothic atmosphere, in my opinion, in the way that this is very grandiose, and you don't really see it in the modernist building as much as you see it in these large cathedrals, which were so I find that very interesting, the alignment of the representation and the intentions of the editors and the
Yeah, I think you have a really good point, and I like your observation about you know, the emphasis on grandiosity, the way that the way that the drawings are composed, but also that small footprint which makes this tower. And then what you were saying about the one figure, so that, I mean, it's very much adhering to Beaux-Arts conventions in these drawings, but what the Tribune did right after the competition, when it started publishing the you know, their design and in various articles for the public, they made a montage and they superimposed the Hood and Howells design on an urban environment that was very active with automobiles and pedestrians, so that, you know, inviting people to imagine what it'll be like when it's actually there. So yeah.
That's super interesting, because also we are in the first post-war period, where there is all this reconstruction happening on the urban platform. So that's really interesting to know that they really put this as in the urban scene. But do you happen? Is there any way we can find these pictures where they are?
Yes, I mean, I have copies of them, and I mean, I just have one, and they're great. They really are. I mean, they just completely bring it alive, but they still feature the building, and no balloons obscuring it. It's different from contemporary practices. But you know, the architects also played with this, because one of the things that they had learned for competitions was that doing dark backgrounds to make their buildings really stand out could be really good for catching the attention of jurors. And then it was also very good for publication. So they were really thinking about strategies to make sure their work was noticed.
And maybe just to add a brief comment on that, because I was also intrigued by the constraint of only delivering black and white drawings. So in a sense, there is an intentionality of evenness, of all proposals having the same comparative structure, which in a sense makes everything even. It's like we share a common ground, you know? So, and there were also anonymous submissions. So there's this intention of evenness and to make comparative discussions much more efficient in a way. But I'm also wondering if for many entries, the idea of delivering in black and white play more in favor or than others. Anyways, just a comment to add on that.
Yeah, it's a good comment and a good question, because I think you're absolutely right about, and you put it really well, this evenness, which sort of evens out the evaluations. And you know, that was also something that architects were talking about, because one of the concerns with in the competition system was that you know, how to make sure that architects aren't doing you know, pyrotechnics through representation that obscure what the design really is. And you know, so there was a desire to make sure that you know, it would be possible to evaluate what was actually there, and not wind up getting caught in, wow, the amazingness of the representation. So that evenness, you know, came from the Tribune specifications, and also came out of discussions in the American profession at the time. Let's see, you had a question at the very end of that about people departing from that. Some did, mainly through drawing style, and you know, rather than the fine lined Beaux-Arts drawing, much bolder drawings and bold washes in the background. And you find that specifically in some of the German entries.
Doesn't the evenness also come from the printing techniques that they used, and the limited, let's say, techniques to also represent?
I'm sure it does. I'm sure it does. I think that's one of the reasons some architects like to do black backgrounds, so that they could you know, work against that evenness.
I had one question. I think it was bringing it back to the Berman's glorious vision of Chicago, of how the public should be part of the built environment, and also the democratic nature that this building should contain to represent the 20th century architecture. So I was just wondering, like, how also in the program this part was integrated, because I feel like there were some elements like bringing in stones from around the world and making it more of an exhibition space, and the crown, which was open to the public. But then how was the program, really distributed in the building itself? So like who got the offices in the Gothic, like the crown, So how that came in place with the...
Oh, good question. You could probably guess who got the offices in the Gothic crown. Robert McCormick and Joseph Patterson, and they each got a corner. And they basically, those were really guarded offices. I mean, you had to go up in an elevator into a reception area, into another reception area, and there would be people who would be, permitting you to, have access to the spaces that the two editors used. And then at some point, Robert McCormick had a sort of secret room and an escape passage planned. And so, you can pull a panel out and there's this little space and a stairway that goes down through the wall. And, this was, he really wanted to protect himself. Not exactly sure about from what. So it was definitely a hierarchical building. And that hierarchy was expressed externally, and it was expressed spatially through, progressively more controlled spaces in the passage up to and through the building. Yeah.
Maybe to relate it to the late entries of the 1980s, was that meant to be well, a tribute to the Tribune Tower, or was it a critique? Or what kind of process allows these re-entries of the same building, of the same site?
Sure. Okay. Oh, it was a really interesting exhibition, and it was an exhibition, not a competition. And the people who participated were invited. And it was a polemic in a way. It was organized to make a case for a passage from modernism into postmodernism. Basically, they weren't using the word postmodernism particularly, but in Chicago, again, the Chicago context is really important here. So by the time this exhibition was planned, the work of Mies van der Rohe reigned in Chicago. And Chicago had rewritten its own history to move from the Chicago school very neatly to Mies van der Rohe. And suggesting that the Chicago school informed the work of Mies, who basically was not interested in recognizing that particular argument, but they created this narrative as part of the identity of Chicago. And so by 1980, when this group of mavericks comes forth, what they want to do is they want to challenge the dominance of that narrative. And they didn't say anything like Charles Jenks, they didn't say modernism is dead, but they wanted to relegate it to the past and create buildings, they said, that would more fully incorporate long-standing traditions and that would be designed to communicate, to be expressive. And they certainly were. So, some of them, were new takes on some of the competition entries. Many of them were, brand new ideas. And so it's, if you get a chance, it's an interesting set of designs to look at, and it says a lot about its moment. But what was also happening then is that they got much more excited about the Tribune competition entries that people had been scoffing at for, by then, 3-4 4 decades. So 3. Anyway, that they've been scoffing at for a long time because, by 1930, the historicizing entries to the Tribune competition and the Tribune Tower were continued passé. And work that was inspired by Saarinen was considered, a way into the future. And we know that then that changed and changed again. And so they were looking back at designs that had been dismissed and saying, look, let's find out what new value we can find in them. But it was always utterly transformed too. So
yeah, I personally always wonder about this cartoonist tendency and like phenomena.
Yeah. And
all these proposals.
And it was a polemic. It was ideas. It was ideas. And it was also very playful. And some of the Tribune competition entries might be far more. It might have been intended to be more playful than I could know, but most definitely there were in the late entries there were some very playful designs.
Do you hear me?
Yes.
Hi. I just maybe to end. I have one. Let's see if I can frame this in the right way. But basically, Chicago had, well, 2, maybe more than that, rivalries: the Chicago Tribune and the Chicago Sun-Times, as kind of newspaper rivalries. And well, let's say famously now in recent years, the Chicago Sun-Times, the site of the Chicago Sun-Times headquarters, which was a kind of lever building derivative, to put it back into a context within which you are sitting in now, Katherine. And it's now become the kind of a site of a Trump hotel. So in kind of our particular media age, I'm just trying to think, what would be, in your opinion, the ultimate competition that would have the same kind of relevancy today for that the Chicago Tribune Tower competition had in 1922?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. And now I'm thinking about it with the specter of Trump Tower over my
well,
shoulder.
that's my antagonism in there.
It's really, oh dear. So I'll try to put that aside for a moment, lest we weep, and I think about, all right. Yeah, I have thought about this in a number of contexts because, I mean, the Tribune competition, was so much orchestrated as a public competition. And this was also the tradition of the City Beautiful. I mean, in order to get the bond issues passed that made it possible to realize North Michigan Avenue or any other City Beautiful development, there was a huge, very well orchestrated educational program. And this was, designed to, not just get people to vote on the money, because many people did, to provide jobs, but beyond that, to create a sense of civic unity. So I could go into more detail than you would want to hear on this. But the most important point about this is that there was a whole structure in place that was about connecting with the public. And one of the issues with this is that the kind of culture and the kind of values that they were marketing were shaped by the city's business and cultural elite. And the goal was in many ways to increase their own hegemony through a process of incorporation of people in a highly diverse city into a unified citizenry that embraced these values. And the Tribune was operating very much in the same tradition in the way that it set up the competition. It didn't issue an 8th grade civics book the way the Plan Commission did, but it did what it did through the pages of the newspaper. So, you know, if we are to think about this today, and most recently I thought about it in terms of the restoration of state capitals. You know, the big Beaux-Arts classical capitals that, you know, are needing major investments in them now. And they were initiated, ours in Minnesota, in a context where there was more of an educational apparatus that was built up around them to, you know, build up interest and acceptance and a buy-in and identification. And, you know, I look at this and at that, it's not, we can't do the same thing now unless we want to, we could not do the same thing unless what we want to do is, you know, bring together the values of an elite and, you know, use those. So if we're to think of an ideal competition right now, we have that it connects with the public. We have an utterly different set of conditions, a different sets of values, and the challenge of thinking about how any one building can you know, represent so many different concerns, values, cultures.
No, do you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that that's a wonderful answer. So I thank you for ending in that way, because earlier with the students we've been talking, they're starting to develop thesis ideas for their thesis, looking through kind of building types. And so I think what you basically answered in such a nice way is that, yeah, buildings are related to their place and time. And there are things that we can relate to the contemporary, but also value systems change, and we have to be able to be accepting of that. So, but at any rate, thank you so much for this very nice lecture. I very much regret, and we all do, that you were not able to be here in person so that we could meet you and host you for a nice dinner and be in one safe space together. But we very much enjoyed the lecture, and we thank you for your camaraderie for being able to do this. This is your last commitment of your academic year, so enjoy your summer holidays, and we will still continue for the next 5 to 6 weeks. And but we do hope that there will be another opportunity to bring you back to the fairy tale village of Delft, and to be with you in person. But in the meantime, thank you for this great talk and contribution to the series. We very much appreciate it. So,
well, thank you. I enjoyed all the questions. They've given me much to think about, and I would love to see you in person at some point, have the chance to talk with all of you.
We will definitely make it happen. We will figure it out. We have a lot of creative thinking behind us. So,
Okay.
anyways, enjoy. Yeah.